Jason, Consul General, who has done extraordinary work under very difficult circumstances, and our thoughts and prayers, of course, with the state of Israel tonight. We gather in a time of seriousness and a time of crisis, in a time when too many Israelis live under the threat of death, when close to 1 million Israelis have now come within range of the rockets that emanate from Gaza. And I have to tell you something, it's wonderful after seeing what we've seen on the streets of Montreal, to be here tonight with all of you, with people, all of whom I know, cherish every human life. You come from the same tradition as myself, where every life is sacred, regardless of national background or religious background. Every human being is created in the image of God. It's good to be with people who mourn with equal intensity and equal passion the loss of all life. You know, the adversary that Israel faces today is an adversary that is cruel, an adversary that continues to use its children and its women and its civilians as human shields. You've all seen the stories. You know how when a threat comes in, a warning comes in, they gather more of them on the roof to serve as children, to have children serve as human shields. I'll quote just one quote to you from the member of the Gaza ruling body, Fatih Hamad, who just said several months ago the following: "The enemies of Allah do not know that the Palestinian people have developed its methods of death and death-seeking. For the Palestinian people, death has become an industry at which women and children excel. The elderly excel at this. That is why we have formed human shields of the women, the children, and the elderly in order to challenge the Zionists. It is as if we were saying to the Zionists, we desire death like you desire life." We dream of peace. Some of our dreams are unrealistic and naive, but we will continue to dream them. One of the things we dream is the day when someday the neighbors of Israel will care about Jewish life. But maybe that dream is unrealistic. The truth is, peace will come to the Middle East. Peace will come to the Middle East the day that Palestinian leaders begin to care about their own children. We don't need them to love us. We don't need them to love our children and be concerned when our children are harmed. We need them only to care about their own children. And when that day comes, there will be peace for everyone. We condemn with the strongest terms possible the mischievous and callous and cynical use of children at a school as shields for firing, and then to shed crocodile tears when Israel does what it has to do to defend its own civilians. There are too many Israeli soldiers in graves today because we were more concerned about their children than they were. That's the reality. The security of the state of Israel and of the future of the Jewish people has fallen on the young shoulders of Israel's defense forces, young men and women, kids who risk their lives, make the ultimate sacrifice for the defense of Israel and the future of our people. And they are castigated and criticized and libeled. One thing we know gathered here tonight, we know them better than CNN. We know them better than the BBC. We know who they are. We know that their hearts are pure and their hands are clean, and we must defend them as much as they defend us. There is this bizarre mischaracterization of nearly everything that goes on. We have heard for months now about an Israeli blockade. Now, first of all, if it's a blockade, it's the flimsiest blockade in the history of mankind. Truckloads and truckloads, even this week, tons and tons of humanitarian goods cross into Gaza. Medical needs, food, everything that could possibly go on. 80% of the energy comes from Israel. And one thing you haven't seen reported, the head of the UN World Food Program last week said it to Israel, the following: stop sending food, our warehouses are full. And when the UN says it, not from UNRWA, of course, that's a whole different beast. When the UN says it, you can believe it. There's also a bit of a confusion here. You know, we're told all the time these rockets are a consequence of the blockade. A blockade that doesn't exist, and if it exists, it's not an Israeli blockade, it's an Egyptian blockade. 700,000 Palestinians 12 months ago Russia crossed a border into Egypt, and then for months media talks about an Israeli blockade as if they think we all suffer from amnesia. But there's a lot of confusion here about the cause of these rockets. So the rockets, we're told, are the consequence of the blockade, but the rockets came before the blockade. The alleged blockade, that flimsy blockade. And then we were told before, well, when Israel was in Gaza, before 2005, we had rockets. Then, because Israelis were in Gaza, then Israel left. And the rockets continued. Then Hamas, in a violent coup, throws out Fatah, and the world responds with this kind of cutoff on the borders. And what happens? Rockets continue to fall. So when Israel's there, the rockets come. When Israel's gone and the food is coming in, the rockets come. After Hamas takes over and the world imposes sanctions, the rockets keep coming. So what's the only plausible explanation of all of this? Those rockets are not a consequence of Israeli action, they are a cause of Israeli action. Everything you see is a reversal of the truth. The purpose of those rockets has one purpose and one purpose only. When Israel's military and civilians are there or when they're not there. When there's some kind of flimsy blockade or not. There's one purpose to those rockets: to shed Jewish blood. And that doesn't matter what the political situation is or isn't. It has no consequence what Israel does or doesn't do. As long as there are Jews to be hit, they will try to hit them. The reality is, I give advice sometimes. I want to give some unsolicited advice to the demonstrators of downtown Montreal. If you ask me, I'm more than happy to give you advice. If you want someone to take you seriously, let me give you a little advice. A little unsolicited advice. Maybe had you gathered after 9/11. Maybe had you gathered after Bala. Maybe had you gathered after the bombings in London and Paris and Madrid. Maybe had you gathered after Mumbai. Maybe had you gathered after the Dolphinarium or the Cloud Pass attack. Maybe someone could take you seriously today. And if the death of Christians, Hindus, and Jews doesn't move you to the streets of Montreal, then maybe the death of Muslims should move you. In the past few years, we've seen 300,000 black Muslims in the south of Sudan murdered by Arab Muslims. We've seen tens of thousands of Muslims killed in internecine battles in Iraq between Shia and Sunni. We have seen Muslims slaughter Muslims all over Somalia. And yet the community of Montreal is paralyzed into passivity because they don't know what to do when Muslims kill other Muslims. All right, let me give you some other advice. If you couldn't gather from Sudan and Somalia and for Iraq, maybe you could have gathered in Chechnya. Tens of thousands of Muslims were killed by Russians. If you couldn't gather for Christians, Hindus, and Jews, and you couldn't gather for Muslims killed by Muslims, maybe you could gather when Muslims are killed by Russians. Tens of thousands were killed as Russia leveled city after city in Chechnya. Tactics that Israel would never consider. But again, you were silent. So what plausible explanation can this be?